In the 1930s, a storm rose from the center of the United States, not of rain or snow, but of Earth itself. Over 100 million acres of farmland across the Great Plains were consumed by blowing soil. Towns disappeared under dunes. Livestock died. In open fields, children suffocated in their own homes. The skies turned black at noon. This was not a freak natural disaster. It wasn't a volcano or a hurricane. It was the result of human error on a national scale. Farmers had torn up native prairie grasses that had anchored the land for millennia. They planted wheat miles and miles of it during an unusually wet period and believed the good times would never end. When the rain stopped, the soil had nothing to hold it in place. What followed was one of the worst environmental collapses in American history. Dust storms swept across the plains for nearly a decade, displacing millions and killing thousands. Entire families became refugees in their own country. The Dust Bowl was a slow-motion disaster, built by greed, ignorance, and government policy and its warning is still relevant today. This is the story of how it began, what it destroyed, and what it left behind. The Dust Bowl began long before the first storm. It started with a promised cheap land, fertile soil, and endless sky. For generations of American settlers, the Great Plains were a blank canvas. The U.S. government had opened the territory to homesteaders through the Homestead Act of 1862, offering 160 acres of land to any citizen willing to farm it. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers arrived by the thousands, carving out farms across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. They found a harsh but workable land covered in native prairie grasses. These grasses weren't just scenery. They were ecological armor, with root systems stretching sometimes 5 feet deep. They held the soil in place and kept it from blowing away during dry seasons. But most settlers didn't know or care about that their goal was to grow wheat, and wheat didn't need grass. With new steel plows and the power of mechanized farming, they tore up millions of acres of prairie, replacing it with crops. What they didn't understand was that the Great Plains had always been dry. The wet years that welcomed early farmers were an anomaly. This region historically went through cycles of drought, but those patterns weren't yet recorded, let alone understood. Farmers mistook the unusual rain for a permanent climate shift. Banks encouraged expansion. Government programs rewarded production. So they plowed deeper, planted more, and stripped the land further. By the 1910s and 1920s, wheat became king. World War I had driven up global demand, and American farmers rose to meet it. Between 1925 and 1930, over 5 million new acres of prairie were broken for farmland, much of it in areas with thin topsoil and high winds. In good years, it worked. But it wasn't sustainable then. The rain stopped. Starting around 1930, the plains fell into a deep and prolonged drought. Year after year, there was almost no measurable precipitation. Crops failed. Grasses didn't grow back. And without vegetation to anchor it, the dry soil was exposed. Windstorms picked it up like talcum powder and carried it across the horizon, the first major dust. Storms came in 1931. By 1932, they were frequent. In 1933, hundreds were recorded across multiple states. By 1934, the Great Plains had lost nearly all its usable topsoil in some areas. Dust storms didn't just ruin crops, they erased entire fields. Farmers watched their land vanish grain by grain, and these weren't mild wind gusts. These were continent-spanning events. One storm in May 1934 carried an estimated 350 million tons of dirt across the United States, dropping dust on Chicago, New York, and even ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Dust seeped into everything, into lungs, into houses, into the gears of machines. By 1935, people no longer wondered if this was temporary. The black blizzards had arrived. These were rolling walls of earth that moved like weather fronts. Eyewitnesses described them as mountains of dust, often thousands of feet high and miles wide. A storm could reduce visibility to 0 in seconds. Static electricity from the airborne soil could arc between people and stall vehicles. Drivers would stop in the road and never make it home. The worst came on April 14, 1935, Black Sunday. The morning began clear and calm. Families left windows open. Farmers returned to their fields. Then the temperature dropped, the wind shifted, and the sky turned a strange copper color. The storm arrived with almost no warning. Eyewitnesses recalled the roar before the dark. In minutes, towns across Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas were swallowed whole. Children screamed in the dark, animals choked to death in barns, and people crawled along fences to find their way home in total blindness. When it passed, homes were buried in sand. Fence lines had vanished. Drifts reached the second floor of buildings. People shook piles of earth from their clothes and looked out on what had once been farmland but now resembled a desert. The ecological collapse was complete. Decades of mismanagement had stripped the land of its defenses. The drought had exposed the flaws, and the wind had done the rest. What made it even more disturbing was that it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, as families watched their surroundings turn, uninhabitable in real time. The worst affected area came to be known as the Dust Bowl, a region stretching across parts of 5 states. But the damage was national. Railways clogged with dirt. Livestock feed had to be imported. Crops failed far beyond the plains due to disrupted distribution chains. And all of this occurred in the middle of the Great Depression, when economic survival was already fragile. People tried to adapt. They soaked towels and nailed them over doors. They shoveled dirt from their floors like snow, but it never stopped coming. The wind returned every week, sometimes every day. Roofs blew off. Wells filled with grit. Eyes turned red and raw. The land had turned against them, but it hadn't acted alone. It had been pushed, while the full scope of the disaster wouldn't be known until years later. Scientists and government officials in the mid-1930s were beginning to realize what had happened. They weren't just facing a natural drought. They were dealing with a man-made ecological collapse. The land had been overworked, overexposed, it ultimately destroyed by the very people who depended on it. By the end of 1935, thousands of farms had been abandoned. Banks foreclosed on land that could no longer produce crops. Entire counties lost more than half their population. The Dust Bowl had revealed a frightening truth. America's industrial farming experiment had exceeded the limits of nature, and there was no quick fix coming. Once the Dust Bowl began, it did not relent. The storms that destroyed crops and swallowed fields didn't stop at the property line. They came for the homes, the lungs, and the lives of the people who stayed behind. For millions, fleeing wasn't an option. Land was tied to survival. Families remained in place, holding out through wind, drought, and darkness. What they endured was not simply a series of bad years, it was a living nightmare that lasted the better part of a decade. Every aspect of daily life was affected by the dust. In homes, windows were sealed with newspapers, towels, or strips of wet cloth. Families nailed wet sheets over doors in an effort to trap the dirt before it could creep in, but nothing truly worked. Dust still poured in through cracks, keyholes, and walls. Within hours of a storm, the inside of a house could look like a construction site. People swept their floors several times a day, knowing it was futile. Children woke up with grit between their teeth. Food, even covered and stored, ended up coated in a fine layer of soil. Eyewitness accounts describe rooms where visibility dropped to a few feet. One Oklahoma resident recalled holding her hand to her face and still not seeing it. Others remembered how silence fell during the worst storms, broken only by the rattle of windows and the scratching of dirt against glass. The light disappeared entirely midday, could become darker than midnight. People described crawling through their own homes to avoid, becoming disoriented or falling downstairs in the darkness. Outside was worse. Livestock suffocated in fields or staggered into fences and collapsed. Birds fell from the sky. Men caught outside during a black blizzard sometimes died within minutes, their lungs filled with airborne soil. In towns like Boise City, Oklahoma, black clouds hit so frequently that they became part of the routine. There are documented cases of schoolchildren being kept overnight because the dust made roads impassable or impossible to see. Health issues quickly became widespread. The fine, powder-like particles of soil were inhaled deeply and often. In healthy adults, this caused coughing, wheezing, and inflammation. In children, the elderly, and the sick, it could be fatal. Doctors reported lungs filled with mud-like sludge. There are accounts of children who died gasping for air, their throats packed with dust that no amount of medicine could clear. Hospitals were overwhelmed, but most people had no access to them. The Red Cross began distributing dust masks, mostly made from gauze and cheesecloth. They helped slightly, but not enough. In some homes, family members would take turns staying awake during the night to monitor others for signs of choking or respiratory failure. In many cases, all they could do was pray. Water was another crisis. Wells dried up or became contaminated. When it did rain, it often came in the form of mud droplets, mixed with soil so dense they stained clothing and burned skin. Water had to be filtered repeatedly. Even then, it often tasted like clay, and still, people tried to continue living. Children went to school wearing wet cloths over their mouths. Teachers taught through masks. Entire lessons were paused, so students could wipe down their desks and textbooks. Farmers continued to till the land, convinced that one more harvest might save them. Women hung laundry that came back dirtier than when it was washed. Care communities lived in a kind of slow-motion emergency for months on end. The psychological toll was immense. People lived with constant anxiety. There was no escaping the noise of the wind, the smell of dust, the feel of grit in the air. Mothers developed obsessive cleaning habits. Some had nervous breakdowns. Suicide rates climbed sharply in several counties. Depression wasn't a term used often in rural America, but it hung heavy in the air along with the dust. Stories circulated of people who simply walked into the storms and never returned. One Kansas farmer reportedly stood outside for hours during a black blizzard, unmoving, silent, until his family dragged him inside. Others sat quietly on their porches, watching the dirt pile against their doors. Entire towns fell into silence. Between storms, quiet not from peace, but from fear. Burials became complicated. In many areas, cemeteries were covered in drifts. Caskets had to be dug from beneath dunes. Dust storms occasionally struck in the middle of funerals, forcing families to abandon grave sites before the service was finished. Pets and animals suffered. 2. Dogs developed severe eye infections. Horses and cattle starved when pastures vanished. In some cases, ranchers were forced to shoot their own herds because they couldn't afford to buy feed or water. The USDA stepped in with emergency slaughter programs, offering meager compensation for animals killed. It was often the only money a family received that year. Even machines broke down. Cars clogged with dust. Radios shorted out. Farm equipment rusted and jammed with dirt. Electrical storms became common as the friction of blowing dust created immense static charges. Sparks would jump between doorknobs and hands, between clothing and skin. Some described it like lightning without a storm. People began to speak of the dust as if it were alive. Some feared it was punishment. Churches filled with people praying for rain. Traveling preachers blamed sin, alcohol, or modernity. Others turned to superstition. One more breath. The Dust Bowl was not one storm, not one moment of terror. It was thousands of days of degradation, illness, and fear. It was families huddled in dark homes, listening for the wind, knowing they could do nothing to stop it. It was a war of attrition, and the dust was winning. By the mid-1930s, many had endured years of this. Some still believed things would return to normal. Others had lost that hope. What came next was not a recovery, but a migration. For many, the only choice left was to leave everything behind. By the middle of the 1930s, staying had become unbearable. The land was ruined, the storms were relentless, and the hope that things would return to normal had long since eroded. For many, there was only one option left: leave. More than 2.5 million people abandoned the Dust Bowl region between 1930 and 1940. making it the largest internal migration in U.S. history during the 20th century. Entire families packed into overburdened cars and trucks, strapping their belongings to the roof, praying the engine would hold out. Some sold their land for pennies. Others simply walked away, leaving behind homes half buried in sand. The destination, for most, was California. Their rumors of fertile fields and steady work circulated widely. Pamphlets and newspaper ads promised high wages for farm laborers. Migrants, desperate and exhausted, believed it. But California wasn't prepared for them, and it didn't welcome them. Locals in California labeled the newcomers Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, or elsewhere. Too many Californians, they were seen as disease-ridden, lazy, and dangerous. Newspapers warned of crime and overpopulation. Some counties attempted to block their entry altogether. In 1936, Los Angeles authorities even set up checkpoints at state lines, turning back families with no money or work prospects. Those who made it through often ended up in makeshift labor camps, clusters of tents, cardboard shacks, and scrapwood shelters built along ditches and roadsides. Sanitation was poor. Food was scarce. Work, when available, was backbreaking. Families earned a few cents per hour picking cotton, fruit, or lettuce. Employers exploited their desperation, knowing they would accept almost any wage. The U.S. government eventually created federal migrant camps better organized, with clean water and bathrooms, but space was limited. The vast majority of Dust Bowl refugees were on their own. The Red Cross and local charities tried to help, but the need far exceeded the resources. Disease, malnutrition, and infant mortality ran high in these camps. One federal inspector reported dozens of children with no shoes and no food in the middle of winter. Their stories became national news through literature and photography. Author John Steinbeck traveled among the migrants while researching The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, the novel. Based on interviews and observation, shocked readers with its portrayal of injustice, starvation, and humiliation. Photographer Dorothea Lange documented the same crisis with haunting precision. Her image of a migrant mother, Florence Owens Thompson, became an icon of American poverty. But this wasn't just a story of migration. It was also one of government reckoning. By the mid-1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration began to understand the scale of the ecological and human disaster, and that much of it was preventable. In 1935, Roosevelt signed into law the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, SCS, a federal agency tasked with repairing the damage. Agronomists and soil scientists, some of whom had been warning of trouble years earlier, were now given authority to teach farmers how to prevent further erosion, introduce practices like contour plowing, strip cropping, cover planting, and crop rotation. These weren't new ideas, but they were largely unknown or ignored by most farmers before the Dust Bowl. The government also launched one of the most ambitious tree planting efforts in U.S. history, known as the Prairie States Forestry Project. The plan called for planting 220 million trees across a 100-mile-wide zone from Texas to North Dakota. These shelter belts would serve as windbreaks, helping to slow down gusts and trap dust before it could become airborne. Roosevelt made public appearances to promote these efforts and sent agricultural experts into affected areas. But even with these interventions, change was slow. Many farmers resisted outside advice. Some distrusted the government outright. Others simply didn't have the money or time to invest in new techniques while trying to survive the day-to-day crises of drought and debt. To make matters worse, much of the land was already beyond repair. Without deep roots to anchor it, and with topsoil gone, vast portions of the plains were simply dead. The soil had blown east, settled in the ocean, and wasn't coming back. For those who remained either by choice or necessity, Dust Bowl left lasting psychological scars. Survivors later described a kind of environmental PTSD. Children who had grown up in the storm years often became adults with severe anxiety and compulsive cleanliness habits. The memory of breathing dirt, of coughing until their throats bled, stayed with them for life. Entire communities disappeared. Counties lost half their populations, schools closed, churches emptied, small towns were erased from maps. And for those who returned after the rains did eventually come back in the early 1940s, what they found was often unrecognizable. The buildings were there, but the spirit had changed. The trust in the land was gone. The trauma wasn't limited to the plains. Across the country, the Dust Bowl became a symbol of vulnerability. It forced a shift in how Americans thought about the environment. No longer could nature be taken for granted. Land could die, crops could vanish, and human behavior could make it worse. By the end of the decade, the worst of the Dust Bowl had passed. Rainfall slowly returned. Conservation efforts began to take hold. But the people who lived through it, those who stayed, those who fled, and those who tried to rebuild carried it with them. The disaster didn't just strip the soil, it stripped away security. It showed that civilization could fail without a single shot being fired. All it took was a plow, a drought, and a wind. The Dust Bowl ended, but the damage never fully healed. By the early 1940s, rains returned to the Great Plains, and the skies cleared. The storms stopped, but the trauma lingered in broken towns, in fractured families, and in the minds of those who had lived through it. It was a disaster born not of nature alone, but of human choices made in ignorance and ambition. Tens of millions of acres had been destroyed. Thousands of lives were lost. Millions were displaced. And all of it had been preventable. The Dust Bowl became a case study in what happens when land is treated as infinite. When warnings are ignored, and when short-term gain replaces long-term understanding. It reshaped farming, forced the government to take environmental stewardship seriously, and left scars that still show in census records, in buried fence posts, and in the testimony of survivors. But time has a way of dulling memory. Today, as aquifers dry, climate volatility grows, and soil degradation returns in new forms, the warning signs echo again. The Dust Bowl was not a fluke. It was a consequence. And if the same mistakes are made again, the wind will come back.